The Blaeberry Girl. One summer's day, a young girl was sent by a granny to pick the blaeberries that were ripening on the bushes on the hillside behind her cottage. The girl took her bucket and ran happily up the hill, for it was a fine sunny day and she loved blaeberries. She made her way from bush to bush. One for the bucket. Bing! The blaeberry hit the bottom of the bucket. And one for me. She popped a sour, sweet berry into her mouth. Two for the bucket. Bing! Bing! And two for me. Another sweet berry went into her mouth. Three for the bucket. Bing! 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 And three for me. Up and up the hill she went, filling her bucket and filling her belly. The sun was beating down and her mouth was dry from the sourness of the berries, so she came to a little bubbling stream. She knelt down, cupped her hands and took a long drink of the cool, clear water. As she leaned over the stream, she heard a jingle of music behind her. She turned around, but there was nothing to be seen. Once again she leaned over to take a drink. Once again she heard this music, but when she whirled round, the music disappeared. This girl always listened to her granny, and her granny was a very wise old woman, so the girl had a fairly good idea what, or should I say, who, was playing the tune. She leaned over the stream one more time, but she didn't fill her hands with water. Instead, she waited and listened. Sure enough, the tune started up again. She reached around behind her back and grabbed at the sound. Something wriggled and squirmed in her fist. Carefully, she turned round and looked at it. Or should I say him, for it was an ugly wee man with a snaggled, naughty beard. He was wearing a tiny, old-fashioned suit of tweed. It was, in fact, a broonie. "Unhand me, you monster!" shouted the little man, although his shout was not very loud, and as he was small enough to fit in the girl's hand. As I've said, the girl always listened closely to the stories her granny told, so she knew that broonies always keep a treasure buried somewhere nearby. She also knew that broonies must always tell the truth, but never be trusted. "I will let you go if you tell me where you keep your treasure," said the girl. The wee broonie tried his best not to speak. He sputtered and pressed his hand against his mouth. His face began to turn a particularly sort of bluish-red colour. "As I've told you, us fairies cannot lie, and that includes lying by not saying anything. Over there, under the blaeberry bush," he said, finally through gritted teeth. "Now put me down." The girl shook her head. "There are lots of blaeberry bushes over there. You're going to have to tell me exactly which one has the treasure underneath." She took the wee fairy over to the nearest bush. "Is your treasure buried here?" she asked. His face turned scarlet. Reluctantly, he shook his head. She carried him to the next bush and asked the same thing. He shook his head. They went from bush to bush until finally they came to one that was in the middle of the hillside. This time, the fairy nodded his head. "Just be sure," the girl asked him. "Is your treasure buried under this bush?" Yes, 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 he spluttered angrily. "Now put me down." The girl was about to set his little feet back on the ground when she had a thought. In order to dig up the treasure, she would have to fetch a spade from the cottage. "I will put you down," she said, "if you promise not to move your treasure." By this time, the wee fairy's face was the colour of a boiled beetroot, and he said, "I promise not to move my treasure." She had another thought. "You have to promise not to move the bush either."